A very warm welcome to everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good day, good evening, from wherever you are in the world. I came across awareness in a very interesting way, and at a time when I probably wasn't even aware that I was talking about awareness. Way back when I was a kid studying in school, it was a school which was founded by a very famous and legendary philosopher called Krishna. He gave us a lot of talks on awareness and coined a phrase called choiceless awareness, which perhaps maybe in a later session I would be able to share with you. And as the years went by, these notes struck a chord in me, though unfortunately when I was a kid, I didn't understand any of it. But as we study awareness and we go along the path of awareness, we discover that it's much more than paying attention, focus, mindfulness, which is now kind of becoming a buzzword in the world of coaching. It's much more than that, as I discovered. And what I would like to share today is a model that I developed, which would help coaches actually use a range of concepts drawn from not just philosophy or spirituality or the methods of coaching or positive psychology, but little bits I've taken from various elements and put it together to create a little model that would be of use to us in the coaching world in helping ourselves and our coaches get to a deeper level of awareness. For instance, if I were to begin, what I'd like to do is share with you a little coaching situation, and I know we have hundreds of coaching situations that we come across in this world. And I'd like to share is now showing up on your screen is that you, for instance, are coaching a person called David, who is the head of operations of a big company in Asia, and he's got to make a presentation to the top management. His performance has been excellent, but David has a problem because he's grown up learning a language which isn't English, and so he sometimes finds it a problem to make an impactful presentation in English. Now, as a coach, what would you do to help David is the question we've come up with. How can David make a great presentation? What's it that we need to do to help David create a wonderful presentation? And when we look at those questions that come up on helping David make these presentations, the issue that we always look at that point in time is that of being self-aware. Self-awareness is actually the key to successful performance. I'm going to take a quick break here, and being self-aware, the key to successful performance is, as I studied this in some depth and shared with other coaches and looked at situations, and the David and his presentation is just one, and there could be many like that. The issue was, why should we be self-aware? What is it that's about self-aware that makes the difference? And I was inspired by this quotation from a very famous tennis player. Many of you would know the name. And the tennis player was Billie Jean King, who said, self-awareness is probably the most important thing towards being a champion. And champions perform. And champions like Billie Jean King perform all the time. So if somebody says that, then I guess we get a little validation. So what were the next questions that come to mind? The next questions that came to mind for me were, in situations that David is facing, I mean a tough situation like the one David is facing, what are the questions that we need to address when we talk about awareness? The questions that we would talk about would be, why awareness? What is the path to awareness? When are you aware? And finally, are you aware that you're aware? Or when you become aware, do you really feel aware? When you look at all these questions that come up, it's not so easy to answer it, but they all come in together as a package. And to work through this process of awareness, I thought in terms of creating a little model. And the little model that I thought of creating was inspired by this quotation that I'm going to share on the screen, which basically said that if you are looking at awareness, it is like the sun. And when it shines on things, they transform. So what are we trying to do here as far as our coachee is concerned, as far as we are concerned, is a bit like bringing about this transformation using awareness. And for the model of awareness, the steps that I went through were, finding each step of awareness was a 5-point process, which was A for awaken. And the next one was W, which I called willpower. And the third one was the call to action. The one that follows action is an interesting one. The one that follows action normally is reflection. And they go hand in hand, as we will discover. And finally, if to close the loop of awareness, it is when you get engaged. So you have awareness, willpower, action, reflection, engagement, and none of it is, though it's shown linearly, though it's shown as if it is a straight line, it isn't. It isn't even cyclical. It could happen in any form as long as you and I, in the process of awareness, understand that all of them come into play. And let's begin with the very first one. Let's begin with what we would like to say, awaken. What is awakening? When you look at awakening, I went through the works of a number of people, and the first step, including Philippe Rochard, who's a scientist in the world of psychology. And some of the work which he spoke about was that he said there are multiple layers of awakening. And for that, he went right back to how a child behaves when the baby is born, for instance. At the time you have a little baby just born, the baby is oblivious. Perhaps later on in a state of confusion. But as the baby grows, and as the baby becomes bigger, there is a sense of discovery. And if at that stage, you were to place a mirror in front of the baby wouldn't recognize it as a mirror as such. All it would see is another object, maybe a toy, and play around with it, but not understand that it's a mirror, till at some point in time, by exploring the situation, it actually discovers and says, hey, this is a mirror, and it's showing something. It doesn't even call it a mirror, but the baby starts seeing the mirror and seeing herself or himself in the mirror. This is typically statistically found to happen around 18 months of age and can go up to 2 years. During the time of exploration, the baby may actually think that the mirror is not him or her, but actually somebody else. And on occasion, they have actually found that the baby has walked behind the mirror to search for that person who's replicating everything he or she is doing. It's fascinating. But then they grow up. And a little later, the same baby is now a little older and looks into the mirror and says, hey, that's me. And I can identify myself in the mirror. And when it identifies him, in the mirror, they start exploring a little more and saying, that's my hand and that's my head. And in one stage, they even discovered that the baby, when these were tests done not only on the babies, but even on the higher species in the animal kingdom, or mammals like elephants and orangutans and dolphins. And dolphins were, of course, considered to be the most intelligent. When they came across the fact that the baby had a sticker put on its head, and the same thing was a mark was put on a dolphin and showed in front of a mirror, reasonably quickly, they discovered that wasn't part of them and tried to remove it. And that's the part at which we call the identification stage. But you move on and you grow up a little more, and then we have a stage called permanence, which is a stage at which the person looking in the mirror has become much older, maybe 3 years old or something, and sees that it's not just me, it's me today. And I could be a different me in the past or in the future, but this is me today. So it's able to connect it to a little bit of a timeline and of history. And final stage of awakening is what they call meta-self-awareness, or being self-conscious, when you look into the mirror not just to find yourself, but also to see how you are reflected in somebody else. So the self-consciousness comes in, and that's when you start, dressing up to see how you would look to somebody else and so on. Now, how does it matter to you and me in terms of, the awareness concept is because you move from oblivion to self-awareness, and that happens not just for babies, but you and me today. In a day, in 24 hours of a day, we move through this cycle multiple times. Maybe when you are in deep sleep, you're oblivious. You could be oblivious even when you are lost in a book or watching a fantastic movie, when you start identifying with the character there and you're in a state of confusion because you're now two people. And you move all the way up to self-consciousness, and this happens in a day multiple times. And what is important for us is to understand where we are at any point in time in these layers of awakening. Let's move on. We have these layers of awakening, we have a model of awareness, and the fact that this awakening phase is one that is dynamically changing. It's a dynamic one, it changes all the time. In a day we move up and down, and here you have a situation where you're coaching David. And he's about to make a presentation, or he's made a presentation, you are having a conversation with him, and you need to perceive more than ask him what the level of awakening he was at, and help him shift to a higher level of self-awareness, because that would make a huge difference to David in his performance. So that would be the question I would leave you with, but let me just go back again and ask you this question and say, David's situation is nothing unique. You and me have the same problem. So how awake were you all this time as I was speaking? Could you, in the chat box, list the 5 steps in the aware model that I mentioned? Could you list all the stages of awakening? I mean, if you've been making notes, don't look at the notes. Try to recollect them, and let's just check and see how good you were at being awake, at being aware. Many of us in conversations tend to have a slight drift in our concentration, in our listening, and often we are formulating another question. The coachee has said something that takes our mind in another plane, and we need to pull ourselves back, which is why the next step comes in, and the next step that I would like to talk about. And before I do that, I will give a few seconds to those of you who did not, probably recollect all the layers, and I, put it up on the screen for a second or two, and say the layers were oblivious, discovery, exploration, identification, permanence, and self-consciousness. And on the other side, of course, the aware model. We would then move on to the next step. And when you talk willpower, this is really based, a lot of what I'm going to share with you is based on my experiences on the sports field. A lot of it is based on my, deep respect and knowledge that I gained from the study of the Inner Game by Tim Galway, who is an absolutely legendary coach with phenomenal results, as many people would testify. The work of John Whitmore. But the inner dialogue that happens to us is really the fact that when we are in a process of wanting to do something, like performing in a presentation, most of the time we'd like to map it to the best we could have done at that time. And oftentimes it does not actually be it's not really the best, and more often than not we do less than what we think we could have done. And then the question gets asked that if you didn't do the best you could do, what pulled you back? What held us back from performing to our peak potential? And this is a question that very often we ask ourselves, and sometimes we don't have the answer. Sometimes we have answers that do not really reflect the truth. It's our guesswork. But the one thing that pulls us back, and I'd like to call that in a very simple word, the one thing that pulls us back is called distraction. Something distracts us. Something impacts our performance from being at its peak. So you would ask then logically, what are distractions? What is it that pulled us back from doing what we should be doing at our best? And if we have to answer that, we've got to look and see what are typical distractions when, for instance, you're making a presentation. And very often when you talk to people who are making presentations, I mean, I would typically ask the audience this, but I can, in the interest of time, I could go ahead and say, some of them that are typically there would be, one would be a fear of failing badly, your confidence coming down, some degree of anxiety. It could be the fact that, you try too hard to achieve something, you want to impress the audience. It could be from, something irritating you at the time of making the presentation. Maybe the slides didn't work or something happened, and then you get irritable, angry, frustrated. It could be that distraction. I mean, another form of distraction is a busy mind, because distraction actually comes from within our own thinking, where there is a conflict in our mind of, different priorities. Conflicting priorities cause distraction. And the last one on the list here, and there are many more, but on the list here is a powerful one for distraction, is boredom. Quite the opposite of a busy mind. And if you look at this list of things that distract us from doing well, we need to question as to what could we, in our using our willpower, deal with it. I mean, how could we handle these distractions so that you keep your performance high? I mean, it's one thing to be awake. In the process of awakening, you keep moving through the path of, being self-aware totally or oblivious. But along the way, you keep pulling yourself back, and you have to ask yourself, why does that happen? Because what really happens is there are these two voices. One is the distracting voice, the voice that, seems to know everything, the voice that tries to control us, the voice that tells us, oh, you can't do very well today, the systems are not good, or there could be anything that the voice will tell you. And at the same time, you have the other voice, which is the voice that actually knows how to do something if it's allowed to do it. But then your own voice, the two voices keep fighting, and when the two voices keep fighting, performance falls. And this distraction takes place in our own mind. In fact, one nice way to symbolize these distractions is to imagine them as perhaps two, monkeys chattering in our head, with one of these monkeys being a kind of a bullying and chattering monkey which tries to control the other one. And in that context, we need to see how to fix it. How do you fix these distractions? Jen, I wonder if, looking at the screen, I think it's probably not come up. Yeah. And so the two monkeys are fighting in our head, and the head, as I'd like to call it, is filling up with trash. Not the things that matter, the things that don't matter. Because what these voices keep telling us, the distracting voice, is that, hey, you messed up last time, you're going to mess up again. It's going to tell you that somebody else is doing better than you, or you're going to be compared unfavorably with somebody else. It's going to tell you it's going to give you information that it's self-critical. It's going to nag you. And finally, it's also going to distract you with irrelevant stuff, because that's the trash. And in our mind, we need to take out this trash. We need to be able to take out the trash that is filling us up. As I speak to you, all of you on this call, as I'm speaking, I can assure you that there's a lot of stuff that you are taking in from what I'm saying, but at the same time, for every individual on this call, there is also a lot of information pouring in from information you already had, or you read, or you have shared somewhere else, and that is clouding the original thinking. And that's the cause of distraction. It happens to everybody. And the trick in this is to be able to move it out. Is to be able to navigate the path through your own mind where the distractions don't pull down your performance. And what actions can you take to do that? What could you take to make sure that you manage these distractions? And what could you take to make sure that you manage these distractions? And some of the techniques that you take to manage distractions, and I like calling this, I really love this phrase, is distract the distraction. And you can do this without too much difficulty because, on the sports field, we do this often. Distracting the distraction is a very good technique on the sports field because and I've shown a picture of a tennis player. I mean, many of you can recognize him, obviously. But the more important thing is that if I were to tell you on a tennis court, watch the ball, make sure you hit the ball by watching it, that's not going to be able to solve the problem because every time you miss the ball, your distracting voice is going to say, hey, you're not playing well today. I mean, the wind conditions are unfavorable, your opponent is too good, and you need to remove that. And many techniques are used for this by tennis coaches, for instance, and I bring in sports because it's a one for the world of business and for the world, and in the general, life coaching space. We tell students on the tennis court, when you're focusing attention, distract your mind by giving it something else to do. For instance, when you hit the ball, see how it's turning, see how it's spinning, see what's written on the ball if you can. And when the ball comes at you at 100 kilometers an hour, it's not easy, but you're focusing attention in a very concentrated way. But at the same time, you are not allowing other thoughts to come in. So this is one very powerful way of actually controlling distraction by distracting it. Another way of doing this is, again, I take a leaf from the inner game training that I use quite often, is a technique that is known as stop, which is where we come in with the concept of reflection and how it works hand in hand with action. Reflection and action go hand in hand. And when reflection and action go hand in hand, the action reflection path is best described in this technique called stop. Stop is a way that we use often, not just sports people, but anybody could use this. When you are caught in a tough situation, say like David in his presentation, what you would do is you to detach yourself from the situation, take a step back, think through the situation, organize your thoughts, and proceed. It's a 4-step process. And it sounds very simple, but it's actually very powerful. And this 4-step process that you go through is absolutely amazing. And I can show it dramatically on a tennis court, for instance, which I'm very fond of doing because that's my sport. For instance, suppose example, you hit a wrong shot or you serve badly and you're going to do it again. You're going to do your next serve. Your memory of the previous one is going to cloud you. It's going to distract you. So that's a great time to take a stop, to step back, to think where you are, figure out that maybe that's not going to happen again. Remove the previous thoughts and proceed. Lots of international sports people do this all the time when they bounce balls or when they take a break, when they towel themselves. And when you're in the corporate world, it's as easy to do that. Take a break. Take a stop. It's simple enough to remember. So that's another way where action, reflection go hand in hand. And this is something that takes place all the time when you are in the situation of, in an awareness situation, the awakening that I mentioned where during a day, cycles keep moving up and down. Taking a stop is really valuable. Reflecting on your action is something that I would encourage everybody to do. And we now come to the last one of the 5 in the model of awareness, which is that David has made a very good presentation. He thinks he has, but he also feels that he could have done much better. So what could you do to let him figure out how he did and what would be the difference between the best he could have done and how he did? Because that's a very subjective one. That's not quantitative, it's very qualitative when we do that. It's a judgmental thing, but you need to have some framework for that. It's a framework that is best suited is probably when we take the concept of flow. As many of you on this call know, the flow state was discovered by Professor Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, and I have adapted it to this particular concept because I think it's brilliant, it's wonderful, it's easy to understand. Not that easy to apply, of course, but it's easy to understand. And if you were to follow the path of the steps to flow using awareness, I'm using it in a little abridged manner by saying that from self-awareness, focusing attention that we did, a little bit of reflection, and you move into engagement. This would be the 4-step process. But to achieve that, there are multiple steps that also have to happen. And in the steps to flow, we need to be sure that there are clear goals that we are set for ourselves, that feedback on whatever we do is happening, so the reflection is there. We control distractions. We're not afraid of failure. And then whenever you're self-conscious, you manage that. You reach that awareness level, which is high by being aware of why am I self-conscious at that point in time. And in effect, you reach a stage where your action and awareness are merged. And that's a wonderful stage to be in. And I'm going to talk about that a little more. And to talk about that a little more, one thing I want to share today is the fact that there are multiple ways we can get to that. And what I'd like to share today is the organization to which I belong, which is the ISEC. And the ISEC have these masteries. And these masteries, there are 9 of them, are exceedingly powerful. And many of them fit into the awareness path. But all I wanted to say was each one of these are powerful, they're cyclical, they're not linear in the least, they're not a process. When you start applying masteries like these, we consider it more a way of being. And to move on, I will take one example and show you how, in the process of awareness, a mastery can fit in. So let's just take the first one, which was fixing goals. And in the ISE mastery, we would use it as setting intentions. Now, in the same way, we could do that for multiple other masteries and multiple other steps on the aware model. Moving on, I'd like to do a quick summary because I'm conscious of the time that we have, and share with you the model that I developed here to help us as a community of coaches, facilitate us in probably identifying some kind of a path that we could use, a powerful path, the more powerful the better, that we could use in creating a greater awareness for ourselves, an awareness for the person we are coaching, and probably a combined level of awareness that will lift the coaching conversation to the level that you would like it to be, which is the highest. Within the aware model, I have a question to ask you. And that's probably an interesting question. And the last question would be that, are you aware that you are aware? And when do you really get aware that you are aware? Because that's the funny part of it, isn't it? I mean, all this conversation that we had is to get aware. And when you are aware, will you be aware that you are aware? And the fun part of it is that if and when you think you are aware that you are aware, you actually stop being aware. And that's interesting, isn't it? And that's really the part I want to leave you with a small thought on that, that if you are aware that you are aware, you're actually stopping being aware, and you need to start again. And on that note, Jen, I would like to conclude for the moment. Thank you very much for being such a wonderful audience and listening to the model that I shared today. I'll be very happy to take questions and try and answer this. Whatever you would like to ask of me, I would be happy to take any questions that you have. Thank you.